Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Welcome to episode 3 of the 6-part special by the Review of Religions on race relations and race and equality in light of the recent events in the United States of America with the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent reaction. In today's show, we're going to be looking at practical solutions. How can we actually eliminate these issues once and for all? And we're going to be looking at some alternative strategies, some proposed solutions which are sometimes overlooked. So, Mulana Azhar, I want to come on to this point that Dr. Hassan has mentioned about speaking out for injustice. And I say this with utmost sensitivity because I'm sitting here, relatively comfortably. And it's not always easy when you're in this situation where you've been oppressed and oppressed and oppressed. And, of course, a person naturally, they have to react. They have to do something to try and remove the injustice. And there's so many different ways to do this. There's so many different philosophies and principles and approaches to how to respond to injustice. I remember, Mulana Azhar, when the Arab Spring occurred, and at the time, people were protesting in certain ways. There might not be a direct like-for-like comparison, but it's just by way of example that, people were responding in different ways, and some people believed that certain ways were the correct way, whether it was forcibly trying to react to the government. And at the time, His Holiness delivered a sermon which was very interesting because he relayed out the Islamic teachings of how a leader should act in this circumstance and how citizens should act. And he outlined the responsibilities of leaders, and it was very frightening for a leader who doesn't fulfill the rights of his citizens. The punishments that God has ordained are extremely frightening. It could make one hair stand on end. On the other hand, he's outlined the way that a citizen should react, that even in every situation to always still respect the government and to leave the matter with God and to not take the law in your own hands. So the question then arises, Mulana Azhar, how does Islam portray that naturally people need to find a solution to this? There's deep pain, there's years of oppression which continues, and we've discussed this in detail. So what solution does Islam offer in these circumstances? How can it take the way forward to try and find a way out for people who are in this oppression?
We are so fortunate in that we receive this direction and guidance from our spiritual leader, Hazrat Masih al-Khamis, and the rest of the world is kind of mired in this quagmire of what to do next, how to go forward. You can see it right now. They reached that point, they say, of inflection, where, as Dr. Hassan Wahab Saab mentioned, so many groups have come forward to protest, which before were sitting on the sidelines or just observing the drama play out and with dispassionate and disinterest, but now suddenly, because of the nature of this particular crime against humanity, George Floyd's killing, and it being recorded for 8 minutes and 46 long seconds, you can hear every aspect of a human life being snuffed out. They couldn't step back. But the question is, it's an emotional response. It is a moment of time. But is it a practical way of resolving an issue? And is it not just a moment, but a movement that will create real systemic change? We don't want just someone to say, change the law of the police so that the police can't use certain maneuvers against citizens. We don't want just a city council or mayor to say, we're going to actually defund the police, meaning take resources of the community and apply it elsewhere. That is not solving the systemic nature of centuries of racial and structural biases. So it requires, in fact, a different kind of approach. And what Hazur is mentioning is resolving the systemic nature of the problem, not just the incident that has captured your attention. What comes to mind is Hazrat Musa, the Prophet Moses, peace be upon him. And you think about his people, the Israelis, the children of Israel, who were enslaved, you can say, an African nation, Egypt, right? And the pharaohs of Egypt were keeping the Israelis enslaved, using them for their economic advantage, as the low person in the economic status to build and create, whatever they want for them, and not providing them anything more than just, sustenance to live. In fact, scripture says that what Pharaoh would do is same thing any oppressor would do. Try to crush all manly spirit to kind of oppose them and allow the women to live, which meaning that allow that docile nature to thrive. But anything opposing, you would crush it any way you can, using force, using societal, systemic, institutional persecution. But I've always thought that when God sends Moses to Egypt, he doesn't say, go grab the Israelis and start rioting in the streets or voting or rebelling or protesting or any kind of movement of that nature. He says, go straight to Pharaoh and address Pharaoh and try to get him through using cogent arguments, using, reasons and signs and kind of a engagement that isn't very confrontational, but that tries to get him to understand the point. So here Moses approaches the Pharaoh with the issues and tries to change this system from the top level that trickles down and affects the people at the lowest level. And I think this is what's the difference in the way we are being told here on how to protest and how to respond in this situation. The movements come and go. They gain popular, sentiments and trends, and then they tend to die out. The issues remain. And the ones who can change the issues are those who have the power. So what Azul is talking about is solving the issue by using voting power. And voting power means here is going to those who are in power and saying, number one, give us the right to vote. Don't disenfranchise us. Don't use all the laws of a certain county or a state or a nation to prevent a certain population from exercising this vote, which will allow them to bring into power leaders who will fulfill their trust and fulfill their rights. And then number two, to utilize the back door, not in so-called in front of the people, but the back room policies and engaging all levels of society, the coalitions, the organizations, and building a consensus that in one voice we will speak out against and use the power of that pressure, that force, to cause governments to concede the right of the people as they are voicing it. So the difference in the Arab Spring and other such movements was the people were trying to use force to coerce the governments, which normally cause the reaction to come from governments to use equal force, and then you have rioting and bloodshed and disorder in the streets. And Quran says, no matter who you are, walk on the earth humbly and do not create disorder in the earth. So we cannot do anything, in fact, that's going to create disorder. And one of those things would be rebelling against lawful authority. So the Prophet of Islam says, even if it's a small, nappy-headed, person of color who is your leader, even that person, whether you agree with them or not, you must accept the concept of lawful authority and follow the rule of law. And so someone asked, well, what do we do if lawful authority is not giving us our rights? He said, fulfill your rights and then pray to God that God will remove that person or change their heart. So that is also an aspect which is of a moral and ethical and spiritual nature that Islam promotes, to try to use this mechanism as well. And this is a better mechanism to achieve results because we see it has happened in the past. This is how you can move nations when the people use a moral and ethical position and pray to God and then oppose through this spiritual force and this moral force and this political voice, as opposed to going out and shutting down economies and causing riots and these things. So we're so grateful for having this guidance from our Khalifa, who is showing the world the way forward, and not just America. It's not just the African Americans or the blacks in America that are having these problems. You have Native Americans, the indigenous population, since day one has been persecuted and denied their rights. You had the Chinese who came in and built, part of America. they too are being positioned as the outsider. And now in America, because of the pandemic, they are being considered, the ones who cause all this problem. So this racial prejudice against them. You have the Latinos, the immigrants on the borders who are facing the immigration issues, that people won't let them come into the country. You have other groups here. Now the Muslims are facing the persecution because of the policies of so-called war against terror. All these things mean that we need to speak in one voice as a human family against oppression, injustice, and the rule of law that doesn't consider absolute justice. So we will find many partners if we look at it that way. And this is what I was saying. It's not just a black and white issue. It's the issue of justice for all people, wherever they may be positioned in society or whatever condition they're facing. And we should raise our voice equally for all of them. This is what he's telling us to do now, but in this manner that Islam is promoting. And I think it would help us. I was asking today, how many protests are going on in America? They're decreasing. The number of people in the streets are going down. I'm getting worried that in what we've seen before, the pattern was they come out in huge numbers, people protest, the government, concedes, says, okay, we arrested somebody, now go back. And then there's no indictments, there's no convictions, and you come right back to square one. That's not the way you change a system. That's just a way of reacting to an incident. And that's not the way you change a nation.
I want to ask just one quick follow-up question, Mulana Azhar, because I was reading an interesting article in The Atlantic today, and perhaps you experienced these times that they're referring to. They were comparing the protests that happened during the civil rights movements in the 60s to today, and they're saying that, in those days, you have to understand, to just organize a protest, it probably took almost 10 years to organize that protest. The logistical things, and just to have that in place was a mammoth task, and that in itself created, whatever value they felt it create. But he was arguing that, although I don't want to misquote the author, he felt that there might be some value in protest today, but in going out in the street, but he felt the fact that now, just by the, simple Facebook messages or a simple Facebook campaign can gather together millions in just a few weeks and then they disperse. He was wondering whether it's is very changed the nature of it and may not be as effective. And he gave an example that in 2003, in America, there were massive rallies opposing the invasion of Iraq, and still the Iraq war went ahead. And then again, there was an Occupy movement in the United States in 600 communities in 70 major cities. It went global, but yet that was against inequality. Many people might have remembered these people camping out outside the different sites in the United States, political, buildings. Yet after that, they say from that point of those protests, which was in 600 communities in 70 major cities, if you compare it with today, inequality is a lot worse. So of course, if somebody wants to take part in a lawful, street protest, which is in the law and is peaceful and there's no violence, then in an individual capacity they can. But I'm wondering, Mulana Sahab, in this comparison, the nature has changed, as you mentioned. Now things are much more short-lived than social media, and so we're looking for long-term solutions. You might have experienced these times yourself back in the 60s. What this author is referring to.
The nature of society has changed because of now the globalization of the world. Globalization means that what's happening halfway around the world, I am witness to real time. There can be a tsunami in Japan, and I'm watching my screen as if I'm right there in Japan. And so likewise, in Japan, they're watching what's happened in the streets in Minneapolis, where George Floyd is being killed unjustly. And so there is a reaction to the event, but there's not a true identity to the experience. And I think today what we're talking about is going beyond why people have come forward. And I mean, it's encouraging to see. It's encouraging, as Dr. Wahab has said, that not just African Americans, because going back into the 60s when Martin Luther King and other groups were protesting, the majority were African Americans. They had skin in the game, as we say it. They were the ones being attacked by the police and being mauled by the dogs, who were being shot, and they're the ones who were losing their lives and had a lot to lose in the process. And there were some other peace activists who were joining them predominantly because of the concept that he was, Martin Luther King was talking about was, bringing it into the church. So you had, these, pacifist types who were coming and joining, but for the most part, it was a Black movement. Now you don't see that. You see it's become a national movement where people of all persuasions, not just generational, but all groups, Asian, Native, Latino, all coming in, whites coming out, and this particularly amongst the youth. You see this diversity of the world. You see the global marketplace in front of your eyes, and which is, I say, encouraging. But as you say, the problem is vision. It's not just passion. They're coming with passion, but do they have a vision to carry it forward? In the 60s, there was a very strong leadership, organizational structure, and a vision to achieve certain targets. It wasn't just putting boots on the ground and putting skin in the games. They worked those back doors. They went into those areas with the politicians. They exerted pressure by knowing the media, capturing them being beaten down like a bunch of dogs would help to win their argument. The same way Gandhi did in India, using the power of the imagery of a class being denied and being abused at the same process. That can't sustain itself. Hate doesn't have much chance of winning it. So I think in the end, yes, there's a struggle now because of the loose nature of trends. People want to just get out there. Part of it was the pandemic. People were cooped up for a number of weeks and they wanted to just get out their houses. So this was also a way to get out. I won't by any means judge people that is based on something as loose and simple as that. But I think there are many factors here which now is playing out that particularly the white Americans and others not in the Black movements who joined, will they sustain that? We don't know. Only time will tell us that. And again, as I said earlier, I think the bigger issue is, what are they going to sustain? Is it just a moment, changing a law, grappling with a few political issues, or are they going to change the structural institutional system in America that has empowered one group and has denied their rights to another? That's the real issue, and only time will tell us as we go forward.
Dr. Basir, the Quran places a lot of emphasis on voting. It's very interesting, and it speaks about giving votes to those who deserve it and handing over trust to those who will be the best leaders. In the United States, it's can you describe the setup of the voting, and how can we empower these people better to get to try and vote? What is the percentage of people who are taking part in votes? What is the reason if they're not? And how can we encourage them? Obviously, sometimes solutions are not that simplistic. There's many layers of things happening. And I know there's issues of disenfranchisement of voting and so on. But based on the fact that the Quran and the guidance from His Holiness as well has been, if you want to bring about change, one of the major ways is, exercise this vote you've been given, which, as Maulana Azhar Saab was mentioning, maybe half a century ago or more, unfortunately, this right was not even there for certain categories of people. You yourself having this strong background as a professor in this field of education, how can, what advice would you give based on this, Quranic commandment? How can we further this better in the United States of America?
Well, absolutely. Voting is a right that so many people have died for. And in the United States, there have been all kinds of attempts to thwart the vote of African Americans and minority voters. And there are very serious attempts now to try to restore some of these voting rights. Generally speaking, American voting behavior is pretty stable. About 60% of voters turn out for the standard presidential election every 4 years, which is when you tend to have the highest voter turnout. In 2008, we saw record numbers just because of the voting for President Barack Obama. African Americans has been kind of tracking close to at about 59% of their voting bloc group as compared to whites. But I think that number has been growing. And I think 2020 might be a very interesting year for electoral politics. I think a lot of people are very agitated and will come forward to vote. I think from an educational standpoint, we're always educating people about the right to vote. and the importance of safeguarding a trust. Electing a leader is a very important thing. We see currently in the United States, not to get too political, how important the election of a good leader is, right? In the middle of a pandemic, you need someone who can lead, right? And can safeguard the rights of the people. So I think people are more sensitive to that now. And so we're seeing lots of get out to vote campaigns. There are lots of people who are, walking the streets and knocking doors and getting the vote out. We also have people running for office. And I mean, if you look on Tuesday's primaries that just passed in the United States, there are lots of young people and African-Americans as well, and women and progressive voices, as we say, who are coming forward as setting themselves forward as candidates and are looking to open up these spaces. So definitely the voting is a critical right. It is a trust that we cannot step aside from. And we should definitely put forward use that tool as a way to effect change in our society. Regardless of the challenges that we're facing, overwhelming numbers in the poll tend to offset many of the attempts to break and manipulate the vote.
Dr. Hassan, what's been your perspective of this? In line, we're speaking of these kind of solutions. They speak a lot about voter suppression as well for people from different backgrounds in America, whether it's African Americans or others. What's been your experience with this? Is it for someone outside, they'll think it's as simple as going out and vote. Is it not the case always? That this is the case. We hear about voter suppression. There was a story recently among 60,000 people, there was only one polling station, and that was a predominantly African American area. So there is this also complaint given that sometimes in some areas they can't always exercise the vote as well as others. What's been your experience on this, and how can people better exercise their vote?
That's an important question to address, and I'll start with a comment made by Imam Azhar Hanif, talking about making sure that we use the back channels to try and effect change, and then agree with Dr. Basir Rodney about the importance of voting. But you see, in this country, even national elections are controlled by states. And the problem that we see in this country is that the turnout is higher in presidential elections, which occur every 4 years. But the midterm elections, which occur in most cases every 2 years, people don't vote. And that's where decisions are made. So let's take disenfranchisement, right? You have situations where the United States, every 10 years, a census is done. And based on the census, a determination is made about how many people live within a particular state. And the electoral maps are drawn or redrawn. So if you live in, say, the state of Illinois, and then you vote every 4 years, and then you say that, well, I've lost trust in the system, this time I'm not even going to bother and then complete the census. What happens is that all of a sudden, the census would show, because you and other people did not complete the census, would suggest that there are less people living in the state of Illinois. And for all you know, you may lose 2 representatives. That's one. So all of a sudden, the representation that you did not think was enough, you are losing even more because you did not do the census. There's another thing. Decisions about where to site schools often depends on that. There's no point putting a school in an area where nobody lives. Now, the mayor or the governor, everybody sees that there are people living there, right? But they are going to go by the census. And so the census says these people in this particular area, we only have 2,000 people living there. Well, our way of citing school requires that we have 5,000 people. Now, all of a sudden, the school that you had there, you are losing. The school is shutting down because the census says that there are no people living there. So as much as people pay attention to national elections, they must also be paying attention to some of these things which really influence election results, the lives of people,
Absolutely.
and all the things that go on there within. As we speak in the city of Chicago, a lot of schools have shut down, and part of it is that they say, well, we don't have people living there, which
Those
we all
areas.
know is not true. But if somebody wants to do something, we shouldn't be helping them to go ahead and then do the wrong thing.
Do
We should be
it.
participating in the process. So we should pay attention to elections, not only the presidential elections, but also local elections and so on and so forth. And I point that Dr. Bashir made about us getting involved. Anybody who has the right to vote and then to stand for office and has good ideas should pay attention and participate in the process. Because otherwise, what we see usually is that people say, oh, politicians are corrupt. We don't trust politicians. And so all the good people leave. What you're doing is you are leaving it to the bad people to keep on doing whatever they're doing.
To perpetuate the injustice.
What's it, Dr. Basir? What does it mean regarding? If you can explain, Dr. Hassan was mentioning that people just go every 4 years for the elections of the president. So, which other elections are they missing out on? Which are those elections on the local, regional level, which are generally neglected? That Dr. Hassan seemed to be implying.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, well, one of the things I think which would be good to point out to the viewers, especially since we have an international audience, is that in the United States, we have layers of government that are all elected. So, for example, in your local city, like here I am in the city of St. Louis, we vote for an alderperson, an alderman, who represents a portion of the city. And that alderman we elect every 4 years. Then we vote for a mayor, and we vote for the mayor every 4 years as well. Then we vote for judges. A lot of our judges and magistrates at the local level, we vote for them. We vote for school board representatives, right? So our elections, our ballots, ballots can be, I'm holding my hand this way, ballots are usually like a legal sized piece of paper. And you have this long list of maybe, depending on the elections that are being held, 10 or 15 different people that you're trying to elect, right? So you vote local, which is like the aldermanic election in a city, or the council election. Then you vote for school board candidates. Then you vote for, community colleges. There's a community college system, and you vote for the community college representative for your district for that board, right? If you're in a county, you vote for the county council members. And, it goes on and on, the different groups of people you can vote for. So elections here are, honestly, we have elections every year, depending on what's up for the vote at different points in time. So some of the challenges around voting that do come up, and we have to address that too, as because we understand some of these challenges, is number one, in the United States, most people that have a felony are not allowed to vote. Their voting rights are taken from them. That's something that, advocates are struggling to restore. They said, look, if somebody served their time and already served their 10 years, 15, 20 years, after incarceration, when they come back into society, don't take their voting rights, give that back to them. In Florida last year, there was a petition where the state of Florida voted to restore the voting rights of 1.5 million people who had been incarcerated and their rights lost, right? So because of the importance of voting, right, then those people are fighting to restore those various rights. We in Missouri passed a law called Clean Missouri, where we said we want the political lines to be drawn by an independent commission, not by any political entity. So not the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or Libertarian Party. We don't want any parties to draw the lines that represent where people live, for which voting takes place. We want an independent commission selected again by the people, right? So we have opportunities where we vote multiple times for all these different things, and we get involved in that. So there's a big thing too around early voting, because one of the things people are saying is there's so many elections, sometimes it's hard to lose a day to go off and vote every year you have to go vote for something. Could we just allow us to mail in our ballots early, and that way the votes are easily counted? So there's advocacy for that as well, that we can mail in our ballots in time so that they can properly be counted. And that's growing in the United States as well, so that people can exercise that right to vote. But there are many, many layers of support and advocacy. We have school board members that are, 19 years old, and because they live in a certain district and they advocate, people vote for them. So many, many layers of voting can go on in the United States. I gave an example earlier. I said, I've seen local aldermanic elections sometimes are decided by like 100 people, right? And what they do is they'll go down to the local retirement village where a lot of the elderly live and just get a whole bus of them and take them to the polls, because transportation to the polls is important. So they get carted over to the polls and then they vote. And before you know it, those 4 nursing homes just voted for the local alderman while everybody's at work. So that's the system, in a nutshell.
Mulana Azhar, we were speaking about this issue of people being incarcerated possibly for petty crimes. I feel it's interesting that Islam does sometimes recognize the difference between something which is a very petty crime and then maybe a basic necessity of life. So as an example, the Khulafa, the successors or the caliphs of Ahmadiyyat have discussed this, and even the second caliph and the promised Messiah, peace be upon him. If someone is, for example, starving and hungry and he has absolutely no recourse, and he happens to go and maybe steal a loaf of bread, that is not necessarily a crime, because they are absolutely desperate. If this person is in a situation where they have absolutely no recourse to anything else genuinely, he genuinely has no recourse to any other thing and he's just trying to stay, or she's trying to stay alive, that is not necessarily is a crime. And perhaps in certain places, in the cases we're speaking about, these very small things are considered as crimes, and then this becomes a cycle where you are incarcerated or imprisoned, and once you're imprisoned you can't get a job. And this reminds me something that the second caliph of the worldwide head of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community says, and he says that do not even consider a thief as a bad person. Now, to quantify, naturally, if someone commits a genuine crime with the intentions of doing a crime, then of course that's something wrong and that's deserving of punishment. But the second caliph says, do not even consider a thief wrong, you yourself as an individual. The reason why is that you may have only witnessed a certain act of his or her where they've committed a theft in that particular moment, but you don't have the right to judge them still, because you don't know that if they went back at night and spent the entire night in worship to God or serving their mother or doing something else, and you've judged them on that one act. So Maulana Azhar, in terms of this issue of petty crimes, Islam does recognize this difference at times, no?
Yes, it's true. And perhaps I wouldn't call it a petty crime. I would call it, as you said, the necessity of survival. And the system itself, it doesn't provide, as the Quran mentions, there are 4 basic requirements of good governance. You must provide food, water, clothing, shelter. It's basic. You can add to that health, and you can add education. These are the general basic things for providing for every citizen. And if you don't provide food, water, and shelter, and the citizens are now in a state of desperation and begin to roam the streets searching what they just need to survive, that you can't call even a petty crime. That is just the desire of it. If you take even the animal order, they won't break into each other's areas where some other animal is residing and has its own family group. It'll only seek what it needs to survive: food, shelter, mate, etc. And so it's a natural order. It's a basic order. It's not hard to understand. And thus Islam has recognized that if the governance, if the state, if the country has failed, it's a failed state now. You're not providing what you're supposed to, as we say, as Martin Luther King said, the contract you have with your citizen. If you gave us a promissory note and don't pay up at the right time, then we as the citizen have been denied our fundamental rights, and this is injustice. So don't call what I'm about to do to get my fundamental right and fundamental needs met as any kind of crime against humanity, against the nation, etc. And I would also, you reminded me of the greatest struggle of institutional racism. You talked about drugs here, and people get arrested for drugs. They come out with a record and now they can't vote. Well, they cannot just vote, they can't get a job. If you go to any place and apply, and you're going to apply that I am Jamal so-and-so, and I got a record for some kind of petty crime or drug offense, he's not going to get employment. What will he now do for the rest of his life to take care of not just himself, but his natural desires to have a family, take care of his dependents, his wife and his children? So he's now again forced under a certain kind of pressure. And if it was just one-off, statistic, yeah, you can dismiss it, or we'll just help out Jamal. But this is the trend. The war on drugs in America was a war on the African American, Latino, brown communities. And the drugs that were being used in the case of the affluent white communities or in the colleges was exactly the same. But police would break into the black community, arrest the young African American and Latinos, et cetera, and pull them in jail. And the whites would go off and graduate from college and start earning a living. Well, now you put him in jail for a few years. As I say, he comes out, he can't vote, he can't get a job, he can't have any way of resettling himself in society. So it now becomes a cycle. He goes back in that cycle of jail, and he remains in that cycle for many cases the rest of his life, or he struggles for the rest of his life getting out with petty jobs. So I think this is a much deeper issue that we've started talking about, is where do we see the signs of institutional racism in the policies that are being made that restrict not just voting, restrict the free movement of people and criminalize behavior which is based on color, and thus deny people, fundamental rights to exist in the world. And, you create this cycle of a dangerous, category of citizen who are now marginalized, who are demonized in media, who people walk in and say, don't go into that neighborhood that's full of those people who are crime ridden and drug infested and this and that. And that's because they never get a chance to break that cycle. So I think what we need to look at is what are the ways of breaking all these cycles that create this institutional system that deprives fundamental rights and opportunities to improve themselves. As Dr. Basir said and Dr. Hassan said, Blacks are no less intelligent than whites. 99% of us are exactly the same. Blacks are no less industrious than whites. Blacks are no less creative than whites. Blacks are no less desirous of having good relations with everybody in this world. See, this has been the problem with Blacks. They have always had openness and inclusion to society, but people always try to exclude them. It's a strange thing. But you would think it's the exact opposite. That they're the dumbest, the laziest, the most useless, the most uncreative. But then you look at the history of our country alone, and you see all this creativity, all the ingenuity, all the inventions by Black people, all the areas where they have excelled, if they've given the opportunity, allowed to educate themselves and their children. This is the amazing American dream that can be achieved if we all become colorblind. If we become colorblind. There was an interesting thing happened in Germany once. The German symphony, I believe, was recruiting people to be part of the symphony. So you had to have a certain skill level to play an instrument to be part of this symphony. And the story goes that one lady would go in, and she was a person of color, and then she'd get on the stage, and she was exceptional in playing her instrument, but always she would fail to be recruited into that symphony. Until finally one day decided what we'll do is we won't let those who are judging the musicians to see who they are. So they drew this curtain in front of the symphony. The people would come on stage and say, okay, so-and-so now play, and the rehearsal would go through. At the end of the day, because they couldn't see who the person was, they began selecting people of color based on their quality of music, not the color of their skin. This is what a colorblind world should be like all the time. But unfortunately, that's a high bar still we haven't reached in this country, and we still face these obstacles based on it.
Thank you once again for watching. Make sure you comment below. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And do not miss episode 4, where we're going to be delving even deeper into some of the very controversial issues that are being discussed nowadays in relation to race, in relation to the United States of America. So don't miss us and join us in episode 4.